2017 was an insane time to be an NBA fan. We had the KD era Warriors dominating the league, a crazy amount of young talent coming in, and an exciting draft class with some of the league's most prestigious teams picking at the top. Going into the draft process, although this would change, the top 3 picks were held by the Celtics, Lakers, and Sixers in that order. These were teams clearly transitioning to new eras for their franchises, but also ones that were extremely excited about this 2017 NBA draft. We begin the video with my favorite thing, an NBA trade, and this one gets complicated. After the draft lottery, the first overall pick was held by the Boston Celtics, who only had this pick because of the Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett disaster trade for the Brooklyn Nets from a few seasons prior. In reality, the Celtics were already a good team and were just one game away from making the 2017 NBA Finals instead of the Cavs, and then they also had the first pick after the lottery thanks to that trade with the Nets, but then decided to make another trade and move back to number 3 while the Sixers moved up to 1. The Sixers, meanwhile, were only at 3 because of a very strange move by the Kings a few years prior where they dumped some salary and traded away the right to swap picks in the 2017 draft. So the Sixers got to go from 5 where they would have been to 3 where the Kings were, and then traded 3 plus an extra first rounder to move up to 1. Okay, now that that's established, the Sixers are on the clock with the first overall pick. At the time, they were starting to finally move out of the process era, with Joel Embiid showing a ton of promise in the 31 games that he played in the prior season and winning 28 games that year, which doesn't sound like a ton, but was an accomplishment for the Sixers at the time. They also had yet to see Ben Simmons, the number 1 pick in the 2016 draft, because he missed the entire season with an injury, so this was kind of seen as the last young piece of the puzzle here at first overall. If they hit this pick and Embiid and Simmons were healthy, they were one of the best young teams in the league, and there's a reason that they were aggressive in moving up to the first pick in this draft. There was a guy that almost the entire league would have taken first overall, Markelle Fultz. Coming out of Washington, he was the ideal modern combo guard prospect. Good size, good athlete, explosive 3-level scorer, and for Philly, that was exactly what they needed and ironically continued to search for after this draft. A guard that could connect Simmons and Embiid with his shooting and creation, and it might not seem like it now, but I'm telling you, the league loved Fultz as a prospect, and 29 of the 30 teams in the league would have taken him first overall, but more on that later. The Sixers made the move up to 1 with the intent of taking Fultz, and they did. Unfortunately, the start to his career went about as badly as it possibly could have. He had some flashes, but never really looked comfortable in a Sixers uniform. There are weird adjustments made to his shooting that turned his form from a dynamic floor spacer in college into a guard that was literally never a threat outside of 15 feet. There were weird injury issues that got related to the change in jump shot form somehow, and then of course the expectations in Philly skyrocketed around him as the team won over 50 games in his rookie year, and the ceiling of the group was clearly immense. If they could get top-level production from the guy that they just moved up in the draft to take first overall. All of this was made that much more frustrating by the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of what Fultz was as a prospect was perfect for those early Sixers teams, but it just never happened. In hindsight, some people have tried to poke holes in the thought process of the Sixers taking Fultz, primarily aimed at Washington's terrible record in his freshman season there, but honestly, this should have worked, and it just didn't for a variety of very strange reasons. Just a few seasons into his time in Philly, they dumped him to Orlando for basically nothing, and although he has rebuilt his career a bit there, he will likely never live up to the expectations of a first overall pick for a lot of different reasons, many of which were simply out of his control. Now we move on to the second overall pick, and man, is the top of this draft just brutal in terms of injury stuff. The Lakers held this pick and were in the middle of one of the worst stretches of team success that they had ever experienced. They were coming off of a 26-win season, had made the playoffs since 2013, and despite some young talent like Julius Randle and Brandon Ingram, just didn't have a super bright future at the time. What became very obvious as we got closer to the draft, though, was that the Lakers were going to take Lonzo Ball here second overall. In college, Ball was one of my favorite prospects of the entirety of the 2010s to watch. Extremely unselfish, great in transition, awesome size, solid defender, just an excellent point guard prospect with a really fun play style at UCLA. The concerns were he wasn't an amazing athlete and his shooting form was really strange, but a lot of people were confident that he was going to become a really good pro at worst and a star at best. Once the Lakers took him, though, things were a bit weird. He only played in 50 games as a rookie and shot the ball terribly, but it was at least clear that there was something there with his playmaking and passing instincts. Then in 2018, LeBron showed up to the Lakers in free agency and everything changed for the Lakers' young core. With a very LeBron-focused team in year 1 in LA, all of Lonzo's per-game stats took a dip, and suddenly just 2 years into his career, his future with the Lakers was very uncertain. He still had a ton of talent, but it was time for an upgrade, so he was sent to the Pelicans as part of a trade package for Anthony Davis, as were a handful of other young Lakers that we're going to talk about in this video. Now, it certainly wasn't a secret that going from playing in LA with with the Lakers to New Orleans with the Pelicans wasn't something that Ball or his family were especially excited about. But his 2 years there were honestly great for his career. He got more responsibility as a creator, improved as a shooter, and developed into a fantastic connective piece with the Pelicans. Unfortunately, he did still struggle with injury issues at times, but it was clear that he had value around the league. After his first 4 years, though, it was time for him to enter into restricted free agency, and the Pelicans chose to trade Lonzo away to the Bulls on a new contract in exchange for basically expiring contracts and a second-round pick. Trade that I 100% hated at the time, but Lonzo didn't want to be in New Orleans, and I was excited to see him in Chicago. With a new core of Lonzo, Alex Caruso, DeMar DeRozan, and Zach LaVine, the Bulls legitimately became one of the best teams in the league through the first 40 games of the 21-22 season. They defended well, shared the ball, were awesome in the clutch, and the connecting piece of all of it was Lonzo, as a perfect complement alongside all their other pieces. And how do I know that he was the main connecting piece? Because as soon as he got hurt, things fell apart for the Bulls. At the beginning of January, the Bulls were the 1 seed in the East, and by season's end, as Lonzo played just 35 games, they were 46-36, and unfortunately, things just never got better. Lonzo still hasn't been able to get his knee to 100%, and his lack of availability has left the Bulls without any kind of real direction, a disappointing roadblock in what looked to be such a promising career in Chicago. Next up now at number 3 is honestly one of the gutsiest trades in NBA history, and I mean that. I already mentioned that the Celtics went from 1 to 3, and they picked up an extra first-round pick, but the reasoning behind it is pretty crazy. So when the Celtics were at 1, they really liked Jayson Tatum a lot. Not that they didn't like Markelle Fultz, but they were probably the only team in the league, as I mentioned earlier, that would have taken Tatum at 1 over Markelle Fultz. And GM at the time of the Celtics, Danny Ainge, saw an opportunity. He knew that the Lakers were locked into Lonzo at 2, which gave him the window to move down to 3 and still get his guy in Tatum while picking up extra assets. The reason this was so risky was 1, he had to be right about Tatum, otherwise he just gave up the first pick for nothing, and 2, the Sixers were a conference rival and a young team on the rise, so if he screwed this deal up and Fultz was awesome, that would be a huge roadblock for Boston, and 3, he had to trust that the Sixers would actually take Fultz and that the Lakers would take Lonzo, because the entire point of the trade was to get Tatum at 3 rather than at 1. As it turned out, Ainge was 100% correct and got his guy in Tatum at 3. Now, by no means was Tatum a can't-miss prospect, but he was an extremely talented one. A great athlete with smooth perimeter skills and great size. If he developed properly, he would become a fantastic two-way wing, and even though he was a bit raw in certain areas of his game, he was exactly what Ainge was looking for. He saw that the NBA was going in the direction of skilled size, wings that could shoot and create and guard, and that's exactly what he got in Tatum. Fultz still could have been really good, but the value in the draft to Ainge lied in picking a wing here over a guard and getting an extra first rounder on top of it. Now, as it turned out, the extra first that Boston got by dropping from 1 to 3 didn't matter as much as they used it to pick Romeo Langford 2 years later, but still, this is an incredible deal as Tatum has become one of the best two-way wings in the entire league and the cornerstone of this new era of Celtics basketball. Next up now is our first non-injury related complete miss at the top of this draft, Josh Jackson to the Phoenix Suns. Going into the 2017 draft, the Suns were where they seemingly always were during this period of time, winning between 20 to 25 games as one of the worst teams in the league. But things were looking up. They had a 20-year-old Devin Booker who was exceeding all expectations and coming off of a 22-point-per-game season, and some other young talent like Alex Len, Marquise Chris, and Dragan Bender. Yes, these guys were exciting at the time because they had been recently drafted and drafted highly. And given that information, it was clear what they needed in this draft, a two-way wing with scoring upside, which was the perfect place to be in this draft. Before we knew that the Celtics were going to take Tatum at 3, there was a real conversation between who Boston would take at 3 between Tatum and Josh Jackson. They were really close as prospects, with Jackson being more raw and athletic while Tatum was more skilled. And once Boston took their guy at 3, the Suns settled for Jackson here at 4, and a lot of people thought that he was going to be really good. His profile was kind of like a slightly worse version of Andrew Wiggins as a prospect, a great athlete that projected as an awesome defender that would need to develop his offensive game but had all the tools. The problem, much like for Wiggins, was that Jackson actually wasn't a very good defender. This was a real problem in draft evaluation at the time, where people would see a great athlete and just assume that they would be a great NBA defender, and Jackson simply wasn't one because he didn't want to be one, and unfortunately for him, the offensive skills never developed either. He did have a bit of a statistical jump with more minutes in year 2 after struggling as a rookie, but just a few years into his career, it became clear that Jackson had very limited upside simply because he didn't develop enough as an offensive player. After 2 seasons with the Suns, he ended up with the Grizzlies, then the Pistons, and the Kings, and was last seen in the NBA in 2022, playing just 291 career games to this point, and what has become one of the most disappointing careers from this draft class. Also, side note, how crazy would a Devin Booker and Jayson Tatum backcourt combo been if Phoenix got him at 4 instead of Josh Jackson? Anyway, on to the next selection, DeAaron Fox to the Kings at number 5. At this point of the draft, things were pretty much wide open, and the Kings went with a player in Fox that had tremendous upside. He was a lightning-fast lead guard out of Kentucky that a lot of people were really excited about. He would need to improve his perimeter jump shot, but worst case, he would be a high-level defender and be able to get in the paint and create, but honestly, things were pretty weird for Fox initially. He had a good rookie year, but struggled with efficiency, and the Kings were not a good environment for him to develop in. In year 2, his stats jumped, and he was a finalist for the Most Improved Player Award, and he continued to improve from there, but things were still just a little bit off. The Kings got better, but still just couldn't make the playoffs, and eventually the backcourt of Fox, Buddy Hield, and then Tyrese Halliburton was just very crowded. It almost felt like they had to pick one to move forward with. And of course, they decided to trade Halliburton to the Pacers for Domantas Sabonis at the 2022 NBA trade deadline, and then things really took off for Fox, as he established himself as one of the best guards in the West while improving a ton as a three-point shooter and allowing Sabonis to be a great offensive hub alongside him, earning his first All-Star selection the following season. Since then, he's continued to develop and honestly has had one of the cooler development arcs of this class because he just kept getting better, and once the situation around him got better as well, he really took off. Speaking of upside, we now get to number 6, Jonathan Isaac of the Orlando Magic. As a prospect, Isaac was one of the more interesting players in this class. Great size with a crazy wingspan and limitless defensive potential, so him going to the Magic made perfect sense. They were constantly just drafting rangy, high upside forwards at the time, so why not add another? The biggest issue for Isaac as a pro was going to be growing his offensive game, which honestly is a theme for a lot of this class. But if he could do that, he would be one of the most unique players in the league because of his defensive impact. Unfortunately for him, another big issue would show up right away: injuries. He played less than 30 games as a rookie, and then after a healthy second season, basically missed the entirety of the next 3 years as well. When he played, it was clear that he had Defensive Player of the Year level ability, which made him an asset even if his offense never developed further, and as of this recording, that potential does still exist. And at such an early stage of his career, it's hard to tell where things are going to go from here, but if he's healthy, Isaac is a player that can make an impact at the NBA level. Next up now is one of the crazier stories from this entire draft. This pick at number 7 was originally held by the Minnesota Timberwolves, but was traded to the Bulls on draft night in a package for Jimmy Butler. So let's deal with that trade first, and then we'll talk about the selection. Minnesota wanted to take a step forward with their young core of Karl-Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins, so they decided to trade this 7th pick, Zach LaVine, and Chris Dunn to Chicago for Butler in the 16th pick in this draft. LaVine became a really good player in Chicago, while Dunn was gone after just a few years, and then the 16th pick became Justin Patton, who played just 22 NBA games across 4 seasons. Butler, meanwhile, had a short but interesting stint in Minnesota. After leading them to the playoffs in his first season there, breaking a long playoff drought for the franchise, he became frustrated in the offseason with the attitude of the young players there and a lack of a contract extension in general. For the following season, he forced his way out to Philadelphia, getting Minnesota much less in exchange for him than they had sent out the year before to Chicago. Speaking of that, let's get back to the 7th pick, where the Chicago Bulls selected Lauri Markkanen. Clearly a talented prospect coming out of college as a perimeter big with a ton of skill and shooting ability, Markkanen had a lot of upside. Whether or not he could compete athletically at the NBA level was a question mark, but a lot of people liked this pick. In Chicago, he had an up and down start to his career as he clearly had talent, immediately showing up and averaging 15 points per game as a rookie. But over the years, he struggled to stay on the floor as much as you'd like him to, and his overall confidence fell as a result. After 4 seasons with the Bulls, Markkanen hit restricted free agency, where the Cleveland Cavaliers worked out a deal to sign and trade him away from Chicago. And in Cleveland, honestly, it was much of the same for Markkanen. He had talent and he could shoot, but he was in a weird front court situation. He had to play at the 3 a ton, and it was just always a bit awkward. Again, the talent was clearly there, and maybe he just needed an ideal fit to stand out. And after just 1 season in Cleveland, he finally got a chance at that ideal fit. He was sent to Utah as part of a package in exchange for Donovan Mitchell, and suddenly averaged 25 points per game in his first season there, finally establishing himself as an all-star caliber player. That play is continued as the recording of this video, making this one of the more interesting stories of this class. It's really rare for a player to suddenly break out on their 3rd team after a handful of years in the league, but that's exactly what happened here. Next up now at number 8 is the New York Knicks selecting Frank Ntilikina. An interesting international prospect, Ntilikina was arguably the single best defensive prospect in the entire class, with fantastic skills to go along with a great physical profile that projected him as a possible lockdown defender in the NBA, which is the only reason that he went in the top 10 of this class, because the offensive side of the ball left a lot to be desired. To put it bluntly, Ntilikina was not an NBA caliber offensive player at the time that he was drafted, and the Knicks were counting on a ton of development on that side of the ball to hopefully end up with a fantastic two-way player here. Unfortunately, that just never happened, and even though his defensive talent was undeniable, and there were some flashes of offensive development both in the NBA and in international play, the perimeter shooting just never improved enough for Ntilikina to make a real impact in the NBA. Moving on now to a fan favorite prospect from this draft, Dennis Smith Jr. He was an extremely athletic one-and-done guard out of NC State with a ton of upside. At just 6'2" though, and without a great jump shot, there were certainly flaws in his game. He had a solid but inefficient rookie year in Dallas, and then went into year 2 with the exciting possibility of partnering with the newly drafted Luka Doncic in the backcourt, something that seemed really intriguing at the time, but that ultimately lasted just 32 games as a midseason trade as part of a package for Kristaps Porzingis brought his time with the Mavericks to an abrupt end. To be honest, Smith just wasn't a good fit alongside Luka because he needed the ball to be effective, wasn't nearly as good as Luka with the ball, and couldn't space the floor off the ball either. Those problems would continue to be an issue for Smith as he bounced around from the Knicks to the Pistons to the Blazers to the Hornets and now the Nets. And the last 2 spots he's really found his niche in the NBA as a high energy guard defender, finally finding his place in the league after such a rough start. Next up now is a trade that at the time felt like a big deal, but honestly meant a whole lot of nothing. At number 10, the Kings were selecting and they went with Zach Collins, but actually traded pick 10 here for picks 15 and 20 in this class. And it's also worth noting that the Kings only had this pick because they received it from New Orleans in the DeMarcus Cousins trade. The Blazers then traded 15 and 20 to get to 10 here, and they picked Zach Collins, a talented big that was just never healthy enough to have a big impact in the NBA. And the 15th and 20th picks were Harry Giles and Justin Jackson respectively. Giles had a similar story to Collins with injuries, but he was even more talented, and Jackson projected as a role player shooter that just never stuck around in the league either. Next up now is a fan favorite, Malik Monk to the Charlotte Hornets. One of my favorite college players at the time, Monk was an extremely explosive offensive player with crazy shot making ability and had the upside of an all-star while also having a pretty safe floor as an offensive weapon off the bench. Through his first 4 seasons in Charlotte, his numbers continued to improve, but he had issues staying on the floor for on and off the court reasons, leading to a 1-year deal with the Lakers after his rookie contract was up, where he put up good numbers, and then his breakout came finally with the Sacramento Kings, where his spark plug offensive output was a perfect fit within the fast-paced system that they were putting together. Monk will likely never be a true star, but is certainly one of the more fun players from this class. Next up now at 12 is Luke Canard to the Detroit Pistons. Canard as a prospect was a really good shooter with some shot creation ability that had a really high floor at the NBA level. With Detroit, he had a solid first 2 seasons before breaking out in his third, but just playing in 28 total games. At that point, the Pistons decided to move on, and he ended up with the Clippers for a few seasons, where he established himself as one of the most efficient shooters in the entire league, leading the NBA in three-point percentage twice, before then ending up with the Grizzlies, where he's continued to be a solid but not particularly exciting player. But speaking of exciting, at 13 now, I want you to think about all the other guards that were picked before this spot. Ntilikina, Canard, Dennis Smith, Malik Monk, Lonzo Ball, Markelle Fultz, all of them went before the best guard in the entire class here. Okay, you can argue between DeAaron Fox and this guy if you want, but I'm taking this guy, Donovan Mitchell. He came into the draft as a bit of a strange prospect, but he had good size for a guard and was a great athlete with a great wingspan and projected as at least a really good defender with some offensive upside. But the offensive part of his game was still developing, and that's pretty much what caused him to fall a little bit here. Pick was actually originally made by the Denver Nuggets, who then traded it to the Utah Jazz for Tyler Lydon, the 24th pick of this draft that played in just 26 NBA games in his career, and Trey Lyles, the 12th pick in the 2015 draft that had shown limited promise in his first 2 seasons. In exchange, the Jazz got Donovan Mitchell. And honestly, it was pretty crazy how immediately he showed up and just established himself as a future star. Remember, the Jazz had just lost Gordon Hayward to the Celtics in free agency and were supposed to go into a rebuild, but instead became a playoff team in Mitchell's rookie season. He continued to improve over the years and turned into one of the best young guards in the entire league, with an insane jump in offensive skill to go along with his other elite traits. There were some efficiency issues early on, but for him to become an all-NBA caliber guy within just a few seasons was pretty incredible. Ultimately, the Jazz didn't find as much success as they would have liked in his first few years and decided to go ahead and rebuild things in 2022 by trading away not only Mitchell, but Rudy Gobert as well. In Cleveland, Mitchell has continued to play at an all-NBA level, something that not even the most optimistic of evaluators likely didn't anticipate, and certainly not so quickly in his career. Not to be outdone, at number 14 is another incredible draft steal, Bam Adebayo. As a prospect coming out of Kentucky, Bam was seen as a high-energy big with limited offensive skill, and a lot of times those guys just become role players in the NBA, which is why he went 14th. The Heat saw a different vision for him, however, as an elite, versatile defender as well as a playmaking option on offense, and once Bam improved his skill set, he became one of the most unique players in the entire league, able to play as a traditional rebounding and rim protecting big, a switch-everything defender at times, and a playmaker all at once, which honestly, nobody really saw coming for him as a prospect. There really isn't much else to say here about Bam other than that he has improved tremendously throughout his career and is one of the great success stories of this draft. Next up is John Collins of the Hawks at 19. He was an undersized forward with great athleticism coming out of college and managed to put together a nice NBA career by expanding his offensive game and eventually being able to space the floor a little bit. He's always been a bit of a tweener in terms of his position because he isn't big enough to be a good defender at the 5, but not quite skilled enough to be a really good 4 either. But he has developed into a solid player and earned himself a massive contract, first on the Hawks and then being salaried dumped to the Jazz, where he has continued to be a solid player. Moving on now to Jarrett Allen at 22 to the Nets. This is a really dark time for the Nets franchise, as I've outlined in previous draft videos, as they didn't control any of their first round picks for a few years and had very limited talent on the roster. They were able to acquire this first round pick though from the Wizards at the 2017 trade deadline in exchange for Bojan Bogdanovic, and this turned out to be a massive deal. Allen was a high upside defensive player with great size and length, but there were question marks about his offensive skill set and his skinny frame. However, over the years he developed into a great rim protector and legit asset for the Nets. The problems for him in Brooklyn though started when Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant joined the team in 2019 and brought DeAndre Jordan along with them. Durant and Irving wanted Jordan to start over Allen despite Allen being the better player, resulting in some turmoil within the team, the firing of head coach Kenny Atkinson, and eventually Allen getting traded from the Nets to the Cavs as part of the James Harden trade in 2021. In Cleveland, Allen has continued to be one of the most underrated bigs in the entire league, a great rim roller and rim protector that is a great asset for any team. Moving on now to one of the most intriguing players in the entire draft class at the time, OG Anunoby. He was a high upside wing defender that a lot of teams really liked, but was coming off of a serious injury in college and didn't show a ton of skill offensively, causing him to fall to 23. Once he got healthy enough though, OG improved as a shooter and cutter and became an extremely valuable two-way player, first with Toronto and now with the Knicks as a result of a trade in 2024. Although his offense still leaves a bit to be desired at times, OG is undoubtedly one of the best and most versatile wing defenders in the entire league, fulfilling the promise that so many people had for him even as a late first round pick. Moving on now to another fan favorite of this draft, Kyle Kuzma. He came into the league as an older prospect but looked ready to contribute right away as a skilled offensive player with NBA size on the wing. Interestingly, the Lakers actually traded for this pick, but not really in the way that you'd think. In the 2017 offseason, the Lakers wanted to dump the massive salary of Timofey Mozgov, so they sent him and D'Angelo Russell to the Nets in exchange for Brook Lopez, but also this 27th overall pick, and Kuzma became a really helpful player for LA. Despite some ups and downs early on for the young guys that I mostly covered in the Lonzo Ball section earlier, Kuzma actually did stick around after the Anthony Davis trade and helped the Lakers win the 2020 NBA title before later being sent to the Wizards in 2021 as part of a trade package for Russell Westbrook. In Washington, the teams have been bad, but Kuzma's continued to improve in an increased role, earning himself a massive new contract as a foundational piece for the Wizards. A nice story for a late first round pick. We move on now to another really cool story, Derek White to the Spurs. As a prospect, he was seen as a solid role player that could shoot a bit and defend as a guard, and honestly, that was about it. He fulfilled that promise in his first few seasons with the Spurs after they took him 29th here, even elevating his offensive game to be an on-ball creator as well. But after 4.5 seasons and a new big contract with the Spurs, they went into a rebuild and decided to move him to the Celtics in exchange for essentially a first-round pick and future pick swap. And I'll be honest, I thought that was too much for Derek White at the time, but he has turned out to be exactly what the Celtics needed, as their rise to one of the best teams in the league has directly coincided with the addition of White. To round out the first round now, we have Josh Hart. Jazz held this pick, but in a trade with the Lakers, he actually ended up in LA. Again, his story is similar to Lonzo Ball's from earlier, as he pretty much immediately established himself as an interesting player for the future, which with the LeBron Lakers meant he was a trade piece. He ended up with the Pelicans in the Anthony Davis trade in 2019, then was sent to the Trailblazers as a trade package for CJ McCollum in 2022, and then moved again to the Knicks in 2023, where he has found a home as a high energy guard, a really good defender, and a hot and cold floor spacer. A solid player. And last up now, we can't end the video without talking about the best player from the second round in this class, Dillon Brooks. He was a high energy defender and a bit of a shot checker on offense, but showed up to the Grizzlies and immediately contributed as a rookie, playing all 82 games and averaging 11 points per game. He had some ups and downs from there and some time in the G League, but by his third and fourth seasons had established himself as a legit piece on the team. He did have some bad habits in terms of shot selection, but he was certainly valuable. He became one of the better defenders in the league, but eventually, after 6 seasons with the Grizzlies, they didn't want to sign him to a new contract because he was just a bit of a wild card for them. So he signed a big new deal with the Rockets, where he has been basically the same player in Houston. Love him or hate him, Brooks has had a very successful career for the 45th overall pick. And that is what happened to the 2017 NBA draft.